At the end of the George W. Bush administration, in the final months of that administration and in the opening months of the Obama administration, there was a great deal of economic problems that really threatened the economy of the nation and the world in many, many ways. In fact, from time to time, you'll read articles by economic experts that refer to this era as being a near collapse of the United States economic system. What we have come to call it is the Great Recession. This refers to the perspective of many that this economic downturn was the most severe economic downturn, the biggest collapse of our system since the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the late 20s and early 30s. In fact, it is very possible that the economic impact of the Great Recession could have been even better were it not for the fact that social programs and government regulations were put in place following the last Great Depression in the Roosevelt administration, and some regulations and protections for individuals as far as their savings are concerned, and those kinds of things that were put in place during the New Deal years. But in any event, the results of the economic downturn, the collapse of several large banks on Wall Street, and the mortgage crisis that resulted from mortgages being extended to many people who couldn't afford them, was that the economy suffered greatly. The stock market figures fell to, I think, less than 50% of its value at one point. And there was a lot of concern for the stability of the United States and in relation to others around the world during this time. So in that context, Obama's campaign message of change seemed to strike home for a lot of individuals, and there were a number of historical things that occurred during the 2008 election. In fact, when you look at the individuals who were running for the major offices on the tickets, each one represented a change from the norm. When you look at, first of all, the most obvious, that Barack Obama is the first American of African American heritage to be nominated by a major political party and then actually to be elected president. In fact, I believe his nomination came on the 45th anniversary of the "I Have a Dream" speech of Martin Luther King gave in the steps of the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. This year also had the strongest showing by a female candidate running for president. This in the Democratic primaries, and that was Hillary Rodham Clinton, who actually came quite close at one point to being the party's nominee. The Republicans nominated the oldest man to ever be nominated by a major party to run for president in John McCain. So there was a strike for the against ageism, and the Republican nominee for vice president, Sarah Palin, of course we're very familiar with her here in Alaska, was the first woman nominated by a major conservative political party to run on a national ticket. There had been one other female candidate for vice president in 1984. Geraldine Ferraro ran with Walter Mondale as he opposed Ronald Reagan for his re-election campaign in 1984. The legacy of the Bush administration's economic policies led to the severe economic crisis in 2007 and 2008, according to Phyllis Day and Jerome Scheel. Some of these policies included tax cuts for the middle and upper class, pursuit of two foreign wars simultaneously, which of course has a lot to do with the economy because a lot of our financial resources then are taken up by these wars, and the adoption of a lot of programs without actually funding them, so that it required the federal deficit to increase. And so this was sort of the Republican approach to things in those days, was to lower revenues and to increase programs, without a funding to provide for them. As the Obama presidency begins, and Obama and the Democrats begin to try to do some things to reverse some of the economic problems that the nation was having, they found a lot of resistance from the Republicans that were there in Congress. resisting efforts to increase taxes for the wealthy, and insisted instead, the Republicans insisted instead upon rolling back social programs. Once again, it's this tendency of the conservatives in the nation to blame the nation's economic woes on those individuals, those entitlement programs, public welfare programs, and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and say that that's the reason for our economic problems, despite the fact that we're spending probably billions a day in foreign wars. Democrats, of course, pushed for increasing tax on the wealthy United States citizens and expanding social spending. Obama came into office promising that no one with an income, I believe, below $250,000 would see tax increases during his administration, and so his efforts really were to increase taxes for the wealthy. There were a number of different programs that were implemented rather quickly after Obama came into office in 2008, or I'm sorry, 2009, January 2009. One of the most famous is the Stimulus Act, officially called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which invested a lot of money, and I do mean a lot of money as you look at it here, essentially to jumpstart the economy. And the main focus of this, the intent of the Stimulus Act, was to reduce unemployment. And unemployment had reached a very high figure late in the Bush administration, especially after the economic downturn and the economic collapses on Wall Street. And so there were a number of different things that needed to be done to kind of get the economy going again, get people back to work. And so there was a $787 billion to jumpstart the economy, and I believe this included the auto industry bailout, which has been sharply criticized. Interestingly enough, General Motors and Chrysler, Ford did not take bailout money, but General Motors and Chrysler did, and a lot of people have been very critical of the Obama administration for doing this. And if the administration had stepped back and allowed those two corporations, those two companies to collapse, the repercussions throughout the economy, aside from the auto industry workers, all of the individuals in the steel industry and metal industries and all those electronics industries and things that contribute to the construction of a new vehicle, I mean, all of those industries would have collapsed as well. And so this was something that I think was a very key element in keeping the economy going in the United States, and very important. Interestingly, there's less criticisms of the Wall Street bailout by those same individuals, where $700 billion was spent. And actually, this was started during the Bush administration and by the Bush Treasury Secretary to begin to bail out some of those banks that had made bad loans and bad investments and those kinds of things. The saying was that they were too big to fail, that if they failed, that it would bring down the entire economy. Maybe true, but nonetheless, you find that there had been less criticisms of the bailout for Wall Street than of the auto industry. There were $288 billion in tax cuts, $224 billion to extend unemployment benefits for those individuals out of work, and also to provide additional funding for education and healthcare, and another $275 billion for job creation, that is shovel-ready projects. That Obama said that things that were ready to go but didn't have the funding, he wanted to fund so that these projects could get underway. And of course, the idea again was increasing employment, reducing unemployment. Personally, I was looking for something a little more along like the WPA, the Work Projects Administration or something. When we have all these problems with bridges and roads in our nation, I was kind of hoping to see some infrastructure funding, being taken care of during all of this, but that didn't happen in this. There wasn't anything specifically designed, and I think part of the reason was that they believed that it was necessary to get people working immediately in order to keep the economy from, getting further and further closer and closer to the precipice. Another signature act, I suppose, in the Obama administration, of course, is what we lovingly refer to as Obamacare, but it's actually the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. $900 billion set aside to lower health care costs, expand health care coverage to more people, and to eliminate barriers to quality health care. Now, one thing that's important here is this is a plan that actually, as Obama pointed out, was the same plan that Mitt Romney implemented in Massachusetts when he was governor there, interestingly. And it's really a plan that leaves a lot of the liberals, a lot of the people to the left, feeling as though it lacks the punch that we need for healthcare in America, because it still leaves millions of people uninsured, and it doesn't give very many options. This plan leans upon private health insurance companies like we have now, although it will create what's called um, uh, it's going to create a market of healthcare insurers that individuals that aren't employed by companies that have group health insurance can go there and kind of pick out the coverage that they want or whatever, and but they're still going to be using private healthcare insurers, and there's no government insurance program outside of Medicaid, of course, and Medicare. There is no single payer plan like that everybody pays into one system, or that one system pays for medical care for everybody. And a lot of the reasons for that is because we have this aversion to anything that smacks of big government, as though this somehow becomes socialism. And while it that kind of plan certainly leans towards socialism, it also is, I think, better at controlling costs than a private plan will be. But time will tell. But most of the people to the left of the political spectrum were quite disappointed with this, what Obamacare came up with, because it just leaves too many people uninsured. But in any event, some of the provisions that creates health benefit exchanges, that's what I was talking about, that this would expand coverage for healthcare to many more Americans. There is a requirement, though, that individuals have coverage. It's called the individual mandate, and this is another thing that was debated in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did rule that this was constitutional to do. It eliminates refusals of insurance companies for pre-existing conditions, so that if you sign on with an employer and you have some chronic condition that has been requiring care, they can deny you coverage for treatment for that care because it's a pre-existing condition, and that has really limited the effectiveness of private health care for a lot of individuals that have chronic conditions over the years. So the pre-existing conditions thing, that whole thing is being wiped out by Obamacare. Will extend coverage to young adults up to 26 years of age. This is quite an improvement over the previous time, so that even if your child is not living in the home until that child is, I think, as long as that child is unmarried at least, up until his 26th or her 26th birthday, they can remain covered on your health insurance plans. That's a population that doesn't use healthcare that much. It's really not that expensive of a thing, and it's kind of one of those popular things in Obamacare that even if Obamacare were to be overturned by Congress someday, which is unlikely, it seems at this point, that's the kind of thing is going to probably continue because everybody likes this. The Affordable Care Act will expand Medicaid to more persons, including children's health insurance programs, so that, like our Denali Kid Care, may be extended to families with even higher incomes that don't have insurance otherwise for their children. Also reducing that donut hole, and the donut hole is for elderly individuals. They have insurance coverage up to a certain point, and beyond catastrophic levels for prescriptions. This is, but in between, where somebody has a lot of prescriptions but not catastrophic amounts, a lot of people, retirees, find themselves on Medicare, find themselves paying for prescriptions in that gap between where the typical insurance ends and catastrophic picks up. And so that's called the donut hole, and Obamacare will reduce that donut hole so that the elderly are less likely to have to pay for insurance themselves. Another feature will be that rather than paying for instances of services, there is a method going to be to link payments for services to the quality of the outcome. And I don't pretend to be able to tell you what that means or how they're going to do that. Rather, but what it means is basically that it is intended to encourage providers to use the treatments that are likely to have results, and not to use every treatment in the book in order to avoid malpractice and all that. There are other provisions as well, by the way, in the Affordable Care Act. I think 9 provisions altogether. I just picked 4 of the larger ones here. The text has more on this if you're interested in looking further into it. But during this period of time, poverty really wasn't much addressed, and some might say this is because of the resistance that Congress was giving to President Obama during his first few years in office. It was not even a secret. It was well known that many Republicans leaders intended to see to it that Obama was a one-term president. And so, and again, this is something that is fact, I believe, that I've read about, that Republican leadership met with the Republican congressional members after President Obama's election, and frankly, made a plan to make it very difficult for him to get his programs passed. So the idea being to keep him from being reelected and get them back into the White House. And so some of the lack of progress in some of these areas may be due to that. The Republican Party has been referred to as the party of no during Obama's first term. But also, as I'll mention a little bit later on, I don't think the president really had much of a focus on poverty in his initial campaign. But in any event, unemployment went up from 7.8% at the beginning of the Obama administration to 9.2% 2.5 years later. So the first half of the Obama administration saw an increase in unemployment. It began to turn the corner at that time and is now down to lower levels. Number of homelessness increased by 3.6% in the same period, and multi-housing vacancy rates increased from 2007 to 2010. In other words, the end of the Bush administration to the first year or two of the Obama administration, there were more vacancies in multi-unit buildings, places where it might be cheaper to live in an apartment, for instance, and those things. There was a greater amount of vacancies, and this suggested, interestingly, that even though unemployment was up and income, was an issue, still people weren't moving into the cheaper housing, and that there's just a lot of. It's just kind of interesting that was happening, and it suggests some other larger issues with income and likely an increase in homelessness. As I said, during his 2008 campaign, Obama really said very little about poverty, and it didn't appear as though he had a lot of interest in poverty programs, at least from the beginning. I would have expected more along those lines. As somebody who, although he's got a law degree from Harvard, and President Obama didn't grow up in the United States in the the conditions that African Americans have grown up in the United States. He grew up in Hawaii and Indonesia. Hawaii is a part of the United States, of course, but I'm talking about the main culture of the United States. His experiences as a young African American, I think, were quite different from most young African Americans of his age group. And he went on to Harvard University, which tells you there that there's a certain amount of privilege that he has enjoyed in his life that many have not, many of us have not. And so I suppose it doesn't surprise me too much that poverty wouldn't be as much on his radar as it might be otherwise. But during the from the second to last year, the last 2 years of the Bush administration into at least the beginning of the Obama administration, the poverty rates increased from 12.5% to 14.3%. The number of TANF recipients, that is, public assistance recipients, climbed during that period of time. At the same time, a bit of this backlash, perhaps because of this, Florida becomes the first state to require drug testing for all welfare recipients. I will set that aside for the moment. I think we've addressed this in other places in the course. I see this as singling out and really this sort of that social control piece of our social welfare programming. It really has very little to do with helping people, but in any event, this is something that is a very hot topic today. The food stamp recipient numbers have increased, and there have been an increase in the number of food insecure households during this period of time, and our women, infants, and children WIC program numbers also increased during this period. So you see that the issues of poverty only became greater, and in fact children were among those most severely affected by the Great Recession. when we look at education and crime during his first administration, members of lower socioeconomic status groups are more likely to commit violent crimes, and they're more likely to have less education. And there's likely a link between those two statements. The United States spends almost 3 times as much per prisoner as it does per public school pupil. 3 times as much for a prisoner than it does for a student. If you grow up in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood, you're going to find that those neighborhoods in general are poorly funded. They have lower performing schools and a lower high school completion rate than other neighborhoods. Now, the Stimulus Act of 2009 did include some money for early education and school reforms. And so I think that there was some intent to address some of this through the Stimulus Act, but nonetheless, nothing particularly focused on this. School vouchers also continue to be debated as an alternative. This is a plan really strongly pushed by the more conservative elements in our political spectrum these days that would give parents money basically that they could use to purchase private education. Whether it would be sufficient to purchase private education is another thing, quality private education at least. But to give them a voucher instead of sending the option of using a voucher to buy private education as opposed to sending their child to a public school. Democrats and the individuals on the left feel that really we should be looking more at improving our schools and increasing funding for education and raising the quality of our education system. Drug-related arrests have increased during this period of time, even though violent crime rate in general has fallen in the United States cities and urban areas. And I don't think this is necessarily due to anybody playing with statistics, as this is something I've been hearing pretty consistently over the last several years, that violent crime is going down in the United States overall. But drug-related arrests have increased. And of interest is the drug-related arrests are more likely to involve racial minorities, that is African American and Hispanic males in particular. And one professor at the Ohio State University, I think her name, I don't know, Jennifer McDonald, something like that. Anyway, she says that she refers to this as the new Jim Crow. Basically, that what we're doing is instead of controlling the movements of African Americans like we did after this, in the years after the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement, and what we're doing now is controlling the movements of young black Africans or young African American males by putting them in prisons, basically, and finding reasons to imprison them. The United States imprisons more people than I think any other nation in the world, including Russia and China, I'm told. And many, if not a majority of those that are in prisons in the United States are there because of drug-related crimes. Now, some of those individuals may be dealers and distributors and people who really need to be behind bars, but most of those individuals that we know of that are in our prisons today are users, people who have had addiction problems, and frankly, putting them in jail doesn't stop their access to drugs by any means, from what I've read at least, so there's a lot of criticism of our system and how we address drugs because of that. And of interest in particular, for instance, the sentencing for crack cocaine is much more severe than for powder cocaine. Now, powder cocaine is more likely to be used by the middle class than the upper class. Crack cocaine is something that's going to be used more by lower socioeconomic individuals on average. And so you see here again, if you know about conflict theory in sociology, conflict theorists would say this is the way to keep the minorities under control is you punish them more severely for essentially the same crime because of they're in lower socioeconomic classes. And so the sentencing for crack cocaine that most likely to be used by lower socioeconomic groups is much more severe than the sentencing for powder cocaine. And this is an interesting thing. And as this slide says, the Justice Department apparently has been working under Obama to eliminate the difference in the sentencing of cocaine cases. But overall, the administration has ignored the role of economics and racial inequalities in arrest and conviction rates. They haven't really addressed it that way. Prisons are overcrowded in a lot of areas, and the courts have been trying to use some alternatives like drug courts and things to avoid the need for incarceration. But our prisons remain overcrowded, and very much so with people arrested for drugs. Now we take some time to take a look at vulnerable populations during the years of the Obama administration. Of course, the most obvious thing, there are 2 women on the national ticket in 2008. What's really quite a striking move, I think, as far as gender is concerned, although there were no women on the ticket in 2012. And I think Michelle Bachmann was the only woman that was running for office that year. I mean, on a national ticket. Obama has appointed 2 women to the United States Supreme Court. One of those was the first Latina to be appointed to the Supreme Court. But women still earn roughly 80% of what men earn in median weekly earnings. That's really a poorly written statement. They earn 80% of men. I think it should say they earn 80% of what men earn in median weekly earnings. And discrimination continues in the workplace. Day writes about caregiver discrimination, where women are denied promotions, sometimes even denied jobs, when employers are aware of the fact that they're the caregiver of young children that will require them to be away from work a lot. Provisions aren't made by many employers to permit that or to sanction that, and so it makes it very difficult for women to move ahead in the business world because of that. There's wage discrimination again, where women earn less, and harassment based on sex. I think the first thing that Obama signed actually in his presidency was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which essentially changed the laws so that a person has more time as an individual to file wage discrimination lawsuits. And what I remember about this is that Lilly Ledbetter was working for, and I forget the company, I want to say Monsanto, but I don't think that's right, was working for a large national corporation at least, and discovered when it came time for her to retire that she was actually was earning so much less than what males who had been hired at the same time, or even those hired after her, had made, and they had gained promotions that she never got, and even though she worked as hard and as well and everything, and so she filed suit to say, wage discrimination suit, and the courts, I believe this was in Alabama, denied her lawsuit because they said that she had filed too late, that she had to file within 90 days or something like this, and I think the point is that you wouldn't know within 90 days that you're being discriminated against on the wages, and so you need more time than that. And so the end result of this is that at least that this has been eliminated for as near as we can tell. It's one more barrier to equal pay eliminated for women. For people of color, without going through the specific statistics that are right in front of you, I will just point out the highlights again. Individuals, African and Hispanic in particular, there's consistently higher unemployment rates compared to whites, although it is lower for Asian Americans. And there are some reasons why Asian Americans employment rates and annual incomes and things appear to be higher, but sometimes they are higher. But if you look behind those statistics, you're going to find out that Asian Americans suffer the same kind of discrimination that other racial and ethnic minorities suffer in the United States. Asian Americans may earn more, but on average, what we find is they have to have a higher degree to get the same job that a Caucasian has. They have to work more hours to earn the same amount of money that a Caucasian earns. Some Asian American households have more than 2 wage earners in them, and so their household income may appear larger, and yet there are more salaries going into that household income. There's a number of different things that if you really kind of look behind these statistics and you take the time to explore it, you see that while Asian Americans appear to be doing well and sometimes even better than the majority, really that's not the case. There's a lower annual income for both individuals and households for people of color, at least among African Americans and Hispanics. Although again, Asian Americans are doing better than the other minorities in both categories, but I think not as well as whites. Their persons of color are more likely to live below the poverty level. Rather dramatic difference there, as you see. They're less likely to have health insurance. This is something that could be addressed by the Affordable Care Act that might begin to close some of that gap. And health insurance is so important, again, for everybody, because if you don't have proper prevention treatments, you don't have proper treatments when you're ill, you're going to miss more work. You're going to be ill more often. You're not going to be as healthy. You're going to miss more school, and all of those kinds of things contribute to lower income, lower prognosis for doing well in the economic system, which really perpetuates the system as it stands right now. People of color are less likely to have the financial cushions to shield them from economic downturns, savings accounts, other family members to fall back on, perhaps those kinds of things. More likely to have home foreclosures, and are also more likely to be targeted by mortgage lenders. Many unscrupulous mortgage lenders apparently really deliberately reached out to minority populations and offering them mortgages that were, where the mortgage rate was going to go up later on, so they could sell the mortgage and make the money on that, and then later on the purchasers might not be able to afford the increase in the mortgage, but the mortgage sellers aren't around any longer. In some cases, mortgage lenders were actually buying up bad risk mortgages, betting essentially that the mortgage would fail, basically, and making money when the mortgages failed. I mean, there were so many unscrupulous things going on in the banks and Wall Street late in the 2007, 8, 9 era that, and in many respects, racial and ethnic minority individuals were targeted by those individuals, and it was called reverse redlining. And if you remember from the days of the civil rights movement, redlining was where mortgage lenders and realtors would sell to African Americans on one side of the line, but not the other. Homes wouldn't be available on the other side of the line than they were, so essentially, increased segregation in some areas, and this is sort of a reverse redlining thing, but. Many people of color, Day-Schiele say, especially African Americans, believed that President Obama's election would improve their lives, and that a black president and former community organizer in poor communities would be sensitive to their plight. This is interesting. President Obama, although a Harvard graduate, a lawyer, he was working as a community organizer. I think he was probably representing individuals in communities, in lawsuits and things, sort of like perhaps legal aid. This really makes him almost like a social worker. And to have a president that is this close to the kind of field that we work in, is something that's pretty remarkable. And so a lot of us, I believed, really thought that Obama's election would strikingly change things for individuals in need. But, as she says here, President Obama has not advocated or brought about any race-specific social policies to improve the conditions of communities of color. Instead, the Obama administration has appeared to choose the racial neutral path of governing and social policy development. And again, I must say, we can't hold Obama totally responsible for the lack of progress in this area, because he's got a Congress that's been very resistant to him, and he's seemed to need to make a number of compromises in order to get what he's gotten. But nonetheless, the individuals, the poor and the disenfranchised are the ones that are probably still suffering the most because of this. And the other thing is being an African American himself, the race-specific policies would render Obama vulnerable to criticisms of racial favoritism, and that would be inconsistent with his One America motto that characterized his campaign. That is, when he campaigned saying that we were beyond race. Now we had evolved beyond the issue where race was of any concern anymore. Looking at the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual population, there has been pretty remarkable movement in this area in the last 15 or 20 years. In 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman by federal law. This is one reason why a marriage in Massachusetts, for instance, of two same-sex couple would not be recognized, perhaps in Georgia, because federal law says that it isn't marriage. Likewise, they're denied many benefits that might be afforded a typical married couple because of DOMA. By 2011, 6 states had legalized marriage for LGBT persons, and by January 2013, 9 states had legalized it. As in addition, District of Columbia and 3 Native American tribes have also legalized same-sex marriage. In 2009 and 2010, benefits were extended in the Obama administration to same-sex partners of federal employees. In 2010, Obama ordered his Justice Department to stop defending DOMA in the federal courts, believing that it was unconstitutional, and also repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell military policy that was also enacted during the Clinton administration. Interestingly, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was by some considered to be a step in the right direction for equal rights for gays. But in fact, what it did was it caused gays to have to really deny their identity in order to get into the military. It still gave the military the option to dismiss individuals who were found to be homosexual, and so really prevented individuals of homosexuals and lesbians, gays and lesbians, from being able to serve in the military of their nation as they wanted to. And so it really didn't advance the cause of gays and lesbians at all, but in many respects worked against them. And so Obama dismissed this, and not without some resistance from many of the old guard in the military establishment. If you've read anything about that, although several very courageous generals and admirals, leaders in the military institution, have come out in favor of repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. In 2012, well, first let me say in May of 2011, the Gallup polls showed that for the first time a majority of Americans believe that gay marriage should be legalized. And in 2012, I wouldn't exactly say leading the nation in this regard, but nonetheless responding to what seems to be the trends in the nation, the president finally declared support of same-sex marriage himself. And this is the first time a president ever came out in favor of same-sex marriage. And I think Time magazine had a cover with Obama's picture saying "America's first gay president" or something, something like that. But this was a remarkable moment. It's something that was probably a long time coming, but it has certainly changed the landscape, I believe. And in fact, more and more now we see. Dick Cheney, during the presidency of George Bush, he was the vice president. Dick Cheney was in favor of same-sex marriage. Dick Cheney had a daughter who was a lesbian. Rob Portman, who is a senator, I believe, from Ohio, who has been mentioned as a vice presidential candidate in the last 2 Republican elections, liked by conservatives, has come out in favor of gay marriage. He has a gay son. And it seems as though many of the leaders of the nation now are coming around to understand things better if it affects them personally, but many still remain resistant to the notion of same-sex marriage if there is no personal connection to them. In March of 2013, the Supreme Court heard 2 relevant cases in regards to same-sex marriage, one of them challenging DOMA's constitutionality altogether. Finally, for the elderly and disabled, I think the Obama administration has had a mixed record in terms of the programs that are here for the elderly at this point. The president has even suggested scaling back on some Social Security benefits as a sort of a compromise effort to bring some of those on the right into his agreeing on a new federal budget. His original proposal for fixing the funding dilemma was to tax those with incomes above 250,000 for Social Security. Now, you understand that above a certain level, and the figure is somewhere in the hundred thousands, you don't pay Social Security taxes anymore. And so what he was suggesting was is that from 250,000 up, that individuals pay Social Security tax, which would do a lot to relieve the funding problem with Social Security. There are so many easy fixes out here for this. With all this hand wringing about the Social Security system collapsing, our leaders aren't willing to do them, and this proposal was rejected by Congress, and instead the Republicans have been proposing cutting Social Security benefits, particularly to the future recipients, all along. And again, it appears that the president is making like he may be willing to sacrifice some of that in order to get other measures passed. The Paul Ryan budget recommends replacing Medicare with private health care plans. Now, it's interesting, you should know that this text was published before Paul Ryan was selected as vice presidential candidate in the 2012 presidential election. And so you see that his budget was catching the attention of social welfare people already because of the harshness of it. He recommended the repeal of course, the Health Care Act, the Obamacare, and he wants to implement block grants for Medicaid. This would basically give states money to the states to administer Medicaid as they see fit, which really tends to mean that fewer people will get benefits and help when that happens. 8.9% of elderly people live below the poverty line, but there is an analysis that shows that if we didn't have Social Security benefits, that number would be somewhere between 4 and 5 times higher. You're really looking at 35 to 45% of elderly persons living below the poverty line if we did not have Social Security in place. But even still, almost 9% of our elderly live below the poverty line now. In many ways, the Great Recession has led to increased costs for the elderly also because, they're on fixed income, and as other things become expensive, they have less money at their disposal. They don't have pay raises to look forward to. They can't go out and get higher paying jobs. They're on a fixed income. And so increases in prices hurts them greatly. There have been proposals to cut SSI benefits to indigent, disabled adults and children as well. This is a very vulnerable population that has no other source of income. And finally, the debate over the national deficit and the solutions for it just really kind of goes on, and it seems sometimes that both sides of the political spectrum are at least of our leadership at least are ignoring the consequences of these proposed cuts to the elderly and really to many vulnerable populations. And this, I think, goes to show you again that our leadership is very much at the center of the political spectrum. If you had true right, true left, you wouldn't have the kinds of compromises that are being suggested at this point to reach some sort of an agreement between the two. But still, there is somehow such a polarized atmosphere in our politics these days that working together doesn't seem to be something that's in the minds of our leadership. And so that will close the first part of this week's lecture on social welfare programming under the Obama administration. If you want to take a break and come back and listen to the second part, we'll see you in a minute.